Hi. So it's the 13th of March 2020, and today is kind of a poignant day for me because it marks exactly 20 years that I have lived in England. It was the 13th of March 2000, and me and my family left Northern Ireland. We actually moved into a new house in Sunderland on the 14th of March, but it's just been on my mind. Not overthinking it, but it's poignant. I'm in a slightly different location today. I'm in my top living room. I'm actually having a nice fire. It's quite chilly in this old Victorian house, so I'll just show you. But a natural fire, often there's, particularly with Storm Dennis recently, there's been a lot of wood lying around, so that's it's convenient. What I want to talk about in this video is sensitivity and I guess how we handle things in life. Now, I could be very broad about that. I'll try and be a little bit more precise about this. I've kept diaries for, well, the whole century basically, since the closing weeks of 1999. I've kept a diary, and I sometimes look back and I sometimes think the way I handled certain things or the way I thought about certain things, I certainly would approach differently today. Um, and the truth is, there were times in the past I feel I probably was a little on the sensitive side of things. A large part of that came about at university. So I think that university is a very testing time. I'm not talking necessarily academically speaking. Obviously, there is challenges with that. I'm talking in terms of socially. And I think a lot of people who haven't been through the university experience, who may even look down on students as being all, apologies for the term here, but spoilt brats or snowflakes or, petulant millennials or whatever they want to call them. It's like anything in life. If you haven't been through something, you can't judge other people in that sense. You can't say it is something that it isn't. Or you can't say, let me rephrase that, you can't just assume something is easy if you haven't been through it. So there may be people who have went straight into the workplace or they've had other endeavors, other challenges, and they kind of look down on students and the whole student experience because they think, oh, well, it's not the real world. What do those whiny students know about hardship? But what I would say, and I'm saying this as someone, by the way, very critical of political correctness and censorship and issues around that we are seeing, particularly recently. What I would say is when you go to university for the first time, particularly if you're going away from your own city, as I did, I went to Wolverhampton, so good 250 miles from where I live, thereabouts. And it was exciting. I had some good memories there, but there were also sometimes I felt desperately alone. And it's not necessarily that I had no friends, I had some good friends there. But what you find in the university environment is, everyone's trying to prove something, everyone's trying to find themselves. This is why I think it's a very different thing if you're studying from home. Like if you're going into campus but you live at home, I think that's a very different experience. But if you actually live on campus, you're adapting to the new environment, you're adapting to being away from home for the first time. And I find a lot of people, and this was Wolverhampton, we're not talking a really prestigious university, but a lot of people are just trying to find themselves. And with that, you get people that sometimes get a little bit cocky or pretentious, cynical, maybe even backstabbing. Um, and I think in some ways, university brings out, it challenges you in a way that forces you to discover yourself. I'm not saying, by the way, that you discover everything about yourself in the time you're at university. Life It is a constant learning experience. But I do think that it is a bit like jumping into the deep end. And at times it can be a little bit scary because there were times I felt, if I'm being totally honest, a little paranoid. I thought people were talking about me. And I even was binge drinking at one point, quite badly. It never escalated to a point of no return, but it was bad enough. And I knew I was doing it as a way to detract, and it did affect my studies. Um, so when we think about sensitivity, I think that people need to just accept that the world is a challenging place. And particularly young people, they need to understand that in this world, people are going to say things that you don't like. People are going to hold opinions that you strongly disagree with. People are going to do things that you don't like. And if you're a passionate person, if you feel strongly about particular subjects, whatever that may be, then you're being true to yourself by speaking out on those things. But what you can't do is keep yourself in a bubble. And that is one problem I see developing with universities nowadays, even more so than when I was at uni in the mid 2000s. Um, I do feel that the whole atmosphere of no platforming and students kind of having trigger warnings and so on. I mean, looking back, I don't think such a concept existed even in the mid 2000s. There was political correctness back then, but I don't think it was quite to this extent. Where students were getting trigger warnings, where they were being told not to clap, where, as in the case of Sheffield University recently, you have basically students being paid to monitor other students for triggering things that they might be saying over alleged racism. Um, and I think actually sensitivity in its worst form can be quite dangerous because it leads to an intolerant mentality whereby the very notion that someone has a different point of view than you'll shrink up and try to run away. I'm not talking about avoiding arguments. That's a different thing. I think that's practical sometimes. I mean, I certainly don't enjoy going out and getting into arguments, and I don't do it as a result. Um, and someone finds that maybe they don't feel they're informed enough about a subject, or maybe they just don't feel comfortable in that sort of intense debate environment. That's fair enough. I wouldn't put any pressure on people to be in that environment. However, the caveat there is I also wouldn't say you can't silence other people because you don't like what they're saying or you don't like their opinions. And you can't demand that everyone sanitizes their own views just to suit what you might find offensive. If people are obviously being offensive, if they're obviously just trying to work people up, I think that's wrong. I think it's doesn't. I don't think there's any merit in that. But if they're simply expressing their opinion and their opinion triggers you, I'm sorry to break it to you, but the problem is yours. It, there's many views and positions I really dislike, but I would never have a situation where I say that person can't have that opinion because it triggers me. I would either debate them, I would just avoid them, I wouldn't engage with them, or I'd not think so much about it. But what I wouldn't do is say that triggers me, so you can't say that. It's just a very actually totalitarian way of thinking. And what I find troubling is a lot of the people who have this mindset, they are under the impression that they're doing it because they're being tolerant. So very often it's under the guise of racism or sexism or homophobia, particularly the first two. Um, and especially the first one, actually, of all issues around this, I think racism is maybe the most pertinent. Um, there's nothing wrong with being conscientious and being vocally against racism. But if you're going around language policing, if you're going around trying to control what other people are thinking, and this is why I think that move at Sheffield is such a problem. You're not expressing tolerance. You're not promoting understanding and diversity. All you're doing is shackling others' thinking. You're never going to convince someone that they're wrong by trying to silence them. The only way you do that, if at all, is by intelligent debate, by discussing the issues with them. Like I say, if someone is being blatantly obnoxious, if they are actually bullying someone, and that is obvious, then I think it's totally legitimate to confront that. But I don't like this tendency for, and the sort of people who are overly sensitive. Incidentally, I don't think sensitivity is entirely a bad thing. Sensitivity can make people more kind. It can make people thoughtful. So from that point of view, it's not a bad thing. But it is a bad thing when people get hung up on it, when they go around looking for reasons to be offended, which, by the way, was one of the trigger warnings at Sheffield. If you even say that, that is a trigger warning. So um, I think it's a big problem when you are so sensitive that other people cannot communicate with you without constantly thinking, oh, am I offending them? And that's the problem with this sort of language policing. It's actually ultra conservative in a sense. So if you think it's open minded and liberal, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. You're not being more thoughtful and kind and compassionate by language policing. All you're doing is being, at best, a nuisance, and at worst, you're actually being quite totalitarian. If there are certain things that upset people, I mean, being honest, most people would have something in their life that they would rather forget. Something in their life that was unpleasant that they would want to move on from. They wouldn't want to particularly talk about it or be reminded of it. So I think in those circumstances, it's understandable if someone politely says, "Look, I don't really want to talk about that," or, "I'm not talking about that." I respect that. I understand that. And there is the other side where you get some people who really do relish arguments and they just shit stir, to put it bluntly. They like to just stoke things up and they like to just get an argument going just for the sake of it. Um, but I really think that if you feel that you're a sensitive person, I'm not saying don't be sensitive because it may be that something in your life, there's good reason that you're sensitive over a particular subject. Say, for example, you had been the victim of sexual abuse as a child. Obviously, that's something you're going to feel very strongly about, and it's something that is going to. I mean, I've never had that experience, so I can't say firsthand what it's like, but I would be very sympathetic to someone who is sensitive about something like that. So I don't think people should be totally blunt about everything. Sensitivity does have its place. All I'm saying is you cannot go through life with a chip on your shoulder. You cannot go through life getting on the defensive every time someone says something slightly different than what the way you think about it. By all means, if they've said something that is just plain factually wrong, you can correct them. Maybe if it's something to do with where you're from or something like that, i.e., if if they say that you're from somewhere that you're not from. It's just a very loose example. But I do have some concern about the younger millennials, not early millennials like myself, but some younger millennials you can tell, and this isn't everyone, but you could tell that they are influenced by this way of thinking. And very often, by the way, the people who are influencing them are baby boomers. So they're middle-aged academics who are encouraging this way of thinking, which, in my opinion, is extremely reckless. Someone described universities as becoming left-wing madrasas, and left-wing because that is where the bias lies. I mean, you don't have to be a right winger to see what's happening here. Um, Basically, don't be an asshole. Okay, that's what I would say. It's not about um, it's not about being overly sensitive. Just don't be an asshole. It's like so many things in this world. Just get the balance right. If someone is upset by something, I mean, let's take the transgender issue for example. If I know there's a transgender person and they have a particular pronoun that they prefer, I'll use that pronoun in their context out of politeness because obviously it matters to them and it's not important for me to go out of my way to get it wrong. So I will use a preferred pronoun. But what I will draw a red line at is them then extending that to say, I need to change my whole way of talking completely, even when I'm not around them. That's something that I won't do, and that's something that I don't think anyone should do. And I sure as hell don't think people should be losing their jobs over it. What you have to remember is no one is going to change their way of thinking to suit you. No one. Your friends and your family may be a bit more understanding and sensitive, but ultimately everyone is an individual. And whilst you can certainly insist on respect if you feel that people are genuinely disrespecting you, and by all means stand up for yourself. I mean, I would encourage anyone to stand up for themselves if they genuinely feel that's the case. Where I draw the line is people who just go around looking for reasons to be offended because someone's being slightly politically incorrect or they have an opinion that you don't entirely agree with. So I mentioned the context, like I was looking back on my life. I don't think I was ever politically correct, but I do see there were times I was maybe a bit sensitive about some things. And like I say, this is university lends itself to this way of thinking because people are feeling they can feel lonely, they can feel confused, they're trying to find themselves. And that's why I think it's important that this doesn't develop more, this way of thinking isn't encouraged because I don't think it helps people. I think it only encourages people to feel like they are victims or feel like it's not preparing them for the real world. That's why it's a problem. So when I see things like trigger warnings and so on, I cringe quite honestly because I think, well, is that like someone else has had a different point of view and that might trigger you? I can understand certain contexts, like I say, if someone has had a really difficult experience in their life, they wouldn't want to be reminded of that. So don't attend that particular lecture or don't you don't have to engage in that debate. But what I don't think you could do is police others' way of thinking. Um, and the final word about identity politics. I've been very critical of identity politics as a development because I think it is far more divisive than it is bridge building. I think it encourages people to feel like perpetual victims. I think it encourages people to be resentful, to think, oh, well, I don't have this, it must be because white men have everything. Or I don't have this because, I mean, you can even extend this to white men. White men might start getting a chip on their shoulder because they think it's constantly going to minorities. So I think all sorts of identity politics can be a problem. What I'm not saying is that I don't think there's anything wrong with people having an appreciation for their heritage in terms of, let's say you're a Nigerian student, you've grown up in the UK, that Nigerian heritage is going to be part of your identity, and that's totally understandable. Um, like Anthony Joshua, the boxer, has a tattoo of Nigeria because it's an important part of his identity. So identity politics in that sense, I don't have a problem with that. Um, and you get a lot of people who are maybe have a mixed heritage, like British Chinese, and they're kind of torn between two sides. In many cases, they don't even speak Chinese. but they're British citizens. They were born in the UK, they've grown up in the UK, but they're visible minorities. So that's always going to be a factor for them. So it might impact. I mean, it's not for me to say how they think, but that's just an example. Being Northern Irish, of course, is a big thing for me. So I guess that's a form of identity politics. Where I think it is a problem is when people constantly use it as an excuse, when they constantly hide behind it for every single shortcoming they have in life. So, say, for example, I said, well, I'm not getting that job because I'm Northern Irish, or I'm not getting that job for that reason. I would, that would be me overthinking it. Having said that, there are actual examples of organisations that have actively discriminated or at least put up some barriers to white male applicants. That's not hyperbole. West Midlands Fire and Rescue Service done that about 2 years ago, on the grounds that they wanted to get more minority and women candidates. Now it was a subtle thing. It was like they asked several fewer questions to the other candidates as they did to white men, but it's still, as far as I'm concerned, a form of discrimination because the challenge for white men is higher. So to me, it's equality is equality. You either have it consistently or you don't have it at all. Um, and there's a lot of other videos I can make around that. But I'll just close by saying this: the world is not easy. Life is not easy. Um, by all means, I think people should defend themselves, and no one, absolutely no one, should be subjected to bullying or being made to feel like shit because of who they are. No one. But by the same token, I don't think that people, if you've been told that you're too sensitive, maybe you need to reflect on that. Maybe you need to consider, am I overthinking things? And there's nothing wrong with being thoughtful, like I say. Sometimes I overthink things, but I do think it's important to understand that others will not change for you. They just won't. And it's a hard lesson in life, but it's just the truth. People will not change to suit you. Um, if if they're discriminating against you, if they're bullying you, then I think there should be avenues to use. But I don't think that people should get so hung up on constantly using identity politics as a way to say, this is why I'm falling back in life. If there's actual evidence that that is the reason, that's a different matter. But I do feel that some people have a chip on the shoulder, to put it bluntly. I feel that some people go around feeling that they're a victim because they have been listening to this mantra for so long that another group wants to keep them down. Um, So it's problematic. And I'm just as critical of white nationalism because I think that is based on identity politics as well. Noam Chomsky said it's the most aggressive form of identity politics. I'm not sure I'd agree with that, but he was right to say that it is an issue because when you get people blaming immigrants for not getting ahead, um, in cases where there is actual tangible discrimination going on, that's a different matter. But I don't really see the merit in blaming desperate people, for problems that others may be experiencing. If you were, and this may be going off on a tangent, but if you were from Syria or Eritrea or some other really, really, really difficult part of the world, you would try to get out. Of course you would. So I don't judge people for trying to flee those situations. Anyway, that's for another video. Um, in the end of the day, all you could do is be true to yourself. And I think if you're true to yourself, you won't get too hung up on what other people think. If you're a public figure, it does matter for obvious reasons. If you're a politician in particular, or a celebrity, but even then, I would say, so often they have kind of PR agents and people like that, or in the case of celebrities. But everyone is human, as we saw with the Caroline Flack suicide recently. Everyone has a breaking point, and kindness does have a place. It really does. So I'm not against sensitivity. I am, however, against let me say, aggressive identity politics.